If nothing else, the pandemic has forced people in Boston to connect with city politics in different ways, usually with less in-person contact. One way to keep engaged is through GBH News, with its team coverage providing focus and insight in multiple platforms. To tell us about the effort is one of the team members, the Boston City Hall reporter, Saraya Wintersmith. Thank you very much for being with us, Saraya.
Thank you so much for having me, Chris.
So there are a lot of viewers who probably have thought of GBH or GBH News, especially over many years, as something on radio or maybe on TV. But what about multi-platform? What does this mean in your coverage of this election?
Multi-platform is the way that we are going over at GBH. And so for the mayor's race, it means that we have this really cool, just nifty site where you can, if you're looking for information about the candidates, get direct links to their pages, but also get tidbits about them, biographical information. You get links to our coverage of some of the major issues of the race. And I think in some cases, it might be more fun than just reading a straight profile of a candidate. You get little tidbits here and there, pictures, video interviews. It means that we're all platforms.
I know it might be a formula, but I'm an easy mark for takeaways. Do you like takeaways?
I do.
I want to ask you, speaking of takeaways, over this past weekend, you would expect with an election like this, the candidates are making their last stashes for any votes that they haven't been able to get so far. You were out with some of the candidates doing that. What were your main impressions?
One, that undecided voters, in some cases, pandemic life is just occupying their attention, and there's a lot to pay attention to, and maybe the race is not the top priority. But in other cases, because of how Boston's elections are structured, and because of the wealth of good, interesting candidates in this race, some of the undecideds are torn really because they're trying to dig into different policy positions. And it's not just a matter of picking the woman candidate or the Black candidate or the Asian candidate, but really trying to see which one they align with the most. And that's got lots of people on the fence.
I was curious about Kim Janey's effort in East Boston over the weekend, because that's an area where Michelle Wu has a lot of backing. She's supported by the local district city councilor, Lydia Edwards. But Kim Janey's been endorsed by unions that might draw a lot of members from East Boston. I think she speaks pretty good Spanish too. So how did that go over?
Yeah, she was campaigning in Spanish and with some public officials from the neighboring municipality of Chelsea. Which is interesting. And like you mentioned, Janey is not the only one trying to campaign in East Boston. I think it's a testament to the power of Latino voters. East Boston, as we know, is heavily Latino, and I think they're trying to activate that portion of the electorate.
What about Andrea Campbell? Because lately there has been more attention to her support, at least previous support of more expansion for charter schools. That has become more of an issue now because of donations to political action committees. What do you see in that?
It's been a hurdle for her, particularly in ultra progressive circles. I think some of those voters are trying to make sense of that position that she took in 2016, supporting the expansion of charter schools. That, coupled with the support that the super PAC, even though it is an indirect entity, it is working to support Andrea Campbell, and it's receiving big sums of money from folks who are pro charter school. And I've heard voters raise questions about what implications that might mean for the Boston public school system, even if Campbell says that it's a state issue and she has no plans to lobby to get the state to take up charter school expansion. It still makes some voters very wary, and it's been hurting her.
Well, you have spent a lot of time, as have some other reporters, looking at contributions, not only to campaign funds, but to political action committees, which are more independent of the candidates. Uh, and you can see a discrepancy between those names and the kind of people and the kind of interests they represent and what we see on the commercials and the ads on social media. What do you make of that discrepancy?
I think the sums of money, number one, are just amazing. I read something from the Office of Campaign and Political Finance that suggested outside groups for the entire campaign season, preliminary and general, spent about 3.7 or 3.8 million altogether between Walsh and Connolly. Right now, Andrea Campbell's super PAC has spent about 1.4 million. So we're already halfway through what was spent on both candidates the last time there was an open race. But to answer your question, I think the discrepancy between some of the folks who are funding the ads and the content of the ads means that whoever is planning the content knows that there are outstanding questions that could hurt the candidates if everyone were fully aware of the funding sources.
I want to ask you about the thing that a lot of us are trying to figure out here is whether this is an election of continuity or change. And some recent elections have delivered a good deal of change, but there's also the possibility that the continuity electorate might be out in larger numbers here. What do you expect?
That's a great question. This is my first time watching a Boston mayoral election, and so I'm trying very hard to stay away from predictions. No matter what, there will be change, I think, in that, of course, the leadership of Boston is going to look a little bit different. The continuity piece, I think we have to wait and see what happens.
Right. I want to ask you about some of the issues that you've been looking at here. These are things that candidates are focusing on, presumably to drum up support. One thing we have heard a lot about is mass and caste, and even the way it seems to overlap with anxiety about public safety, despite the drop in some of the serious crime figures. Tell me about the candidates who you seem to think are running the most with that theme.
I think Andrea Campbell has really lifted up the fact that she was the first person to go out there and roll out policy suggestions for dealing with mass and caste. Since then, several of the other candidates have taken up the suggestion of ferries as a way to get around the legal battle that's going on over the bridge to Long Island. Also, since then, several candidates have committed money or committed to spending federal pandemic relief money to setting up sort of a 24-hour team that would be there to assist people and refer them to services. Obviously, everyone is talking about the decentralization of services, the need to disperse folks is connected to where they can get services. And if it stays concentrated in that area, then it's going to continue to impact the businesses and the neighbors who live there. So that's what we've been hearing on mass and caste. And it is connected to crime, as you mentioned. One of the candidates in the race, City Councilor Anissa Asabi George, I think has really tried to distinguish herself not only on mass and caste, but on the issue of police and police reform and how to deal with crime. She is one of the few candidates who has called for adding more officers to the force. She is the only candidate who has consistently rejected the idea of defunding or reallocation. They mean different things to different people, but either way, she has rejected it all consistently, and that has made her really distinctive in this race. And so if you're a single issue voter who cares about crime, who wants to support police officers, who wants more officers on the force as an answer to public safety, then she's probably your candidate.
Well, I'm sure a lot of voters still want police reform and accountability that was maybe more apparent last year, but how is that being reflected in the campaigning right now?
I think it's tricky. There was one poll either in June or July, a Boston Globe and Suffolk University poll that asked voters whether police reform was a top issue, and maybe it ranked 5th or 6th. But when it asked voters, those same voters, if reallocating police resources to social services was important, that was the answer. That popped up, I think maybe 40 or 30% of voters supported that. I think it's reflected in the campaigns by you hearing candidates saying not so much that they mean to defund or reallocate, but concentrating more on mental health services, social services, restructuring the police department so that those things are improved, and subsequently perhaps will save money also.
Finally, Saraya, of course, you go out, you cover these stories, you post things, but you're at least, if not necessarily in the same building, you're with these other members of your team, you're having these conversations. Some of them we hear on podcasts. What's that chemistry like for you?
It's been fun because I am just getting to know the beat and just getting to know the new team. I came to GBH News as a community reporter covering Dorchester and Roxbury and Mattapan. I live out in Dorchester. That's where I spent most of my time for my first 2 years at GBH. I got moved to the politics team and started covering the mayor's race in April. And so getting to know a new editor, Peter Kadzis, is wonderful. Getting to know the senior reporter, getting to interact with the State House reporter, Mike Dean, it's been fun.
Well, I know you have some experience covering politics and government even before Boston, but you've done a great job getting to know this place. You certainly made me feel at home. So finally, one more thing. If people want to get in touch with what you're posting or podcasting at GBH News, what's the best way for them to locate that?
Sure. So the Scrum is at wgbh.org. We debut it every Thursday, although this week we will not have it because we are doing our live show to handicap Tuesday night's election. And I'm on Twitter at @Wintersmith.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Saraya Wintersmith from GBH News. We'll have more news here in just a moment.